Good evening, I'm Dana King. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are David Baker, San Francisco Chronicle energy reporter, and Lauren Sumner, KQED science reporter, and Dan Walters, Sacramento Bee columnist, joining us from the state capitol. They say the third time is a charm, and California's third on-time budget in 3 years is more than that. It comes with $1 billion surplus for a rainy day. But before passing out the champagne, that budget is based on revenue estimates, which are notoriously hard to predict. Dan, thanks for joining us. Is this budget really balanced?
Well, that's, as Bill Clinton said, under another set of circumstances, it depends on what your definition of balanced is. And by the way, it's only the second year in a row they've done on time. 2 years ago, they did it, and then Jerry Brown vetoed it, and officially it was late. No, it all depends on what your definition of balanced is. It's balanced in the sense that the appropriations that are in the budget can be paid for. But the budget also ignores some big ticket items, some very big things that they simply aren't doing. For example, the state teachers retirement system says it needs $4.5 billion more a year to remain solvent. And the state should probably be putting another $1 billion a year into retiree health care because that unfunded liability is also growing. And if you did that, the budget would be unbalanced. So is it balanced? It's all in the eye of the beholder. So to get to this point, though, how did it happen? Was it just Jerry Brown's leadership? Was this put together based on his strengths? There's no bipartisanship on this. The Republicans didn't want this budget. Well, it's part of it. A big part of it is the governor. He did kind of crack down on spending when he came into office a couple of years ago. Democrats swallow hard, but they did swallow it. But the big thing is, frankly, is that the voters passed new taxes last year at the governor's behest, about $6 billion, maybe even $7 billion worth of new taxes that covered the gap between what the state had in revenue and what it was still spending even after spending cuts in earlier years. And basically it kind of cut the thing in half, and they balanced it out at about $96 billion a year. That's less than the budget once was. That's the general fund budget. It had been as high as $103 billion at one time. But then if you look at it another way, since then they've also are shoveling nearly $6 billion a year to county governments to cover for realignment. That's money the state's not taking in. They're just redirecting it to counties. You put that in there, the budget's really more like probably around $102 or $103 billion. And that makes it equal to the highest budget we've ever had.
You know, the revenue projections that they're depending upon for this budget, how realistic are they? Are they very conservative, or are they sort of pie in the sky?
They're pretty conservative, actually. The Democrats in the legislature wanted to use about a $3 billion higher revenue number that the legislative analysts had given them. But Jerry said no. He said he would rather err on the side of caution. If the money shows up later, they'll talk about it later. But he wanted to base this budget on the more conservative sort of revenue number that his Department of Finance came up with. And finally, his fellow Democrats said they would. But they held out the possibility that they may raise spending later in the year on health and welfare programs if more money shows up. He has said, however, he's not made any agreement to that, and he's inclined to put any extra money into debt repayment or a rainy day fund.
How serious do you think the Democrats are about that? I mean, would they actually get in a game of chicken with their own governor?
I don't think they would get into a game of chicken. I think they'd go to him and say, we would like to do this. And if he said no, they're probably stuck with it, because anything they want to do, he'd have to sign. And I know there's a lot of speculation around the Capitol. Well, they could override his veto and blah, blah, blah. Not going to happen. The governor has the whip hand in this situation. And that was demonstrated earlier in the week when he prevailed on his fellow Democrats in terms of both spending and revenue estimates. He has the control over the thing, and he's pretty tight. He's always been actually pretty tight. I covered him during his first administration. He was pretty tight then as well. He's a frugal person, cheapskate, he says, and it shows.
This budget borrows from California's kind of cap and trade funds. That's the statewide carbon emissions program. I think it's $500 million. That's money that had been earmarked more or less for kind of clean energy and efficiency programs. I mean, what's the justification? Are they going to pay that back ever?
Well, yes. The governor says he'll pay it back when they have the programs ready to be financed. In other words, he sees it as a cash flow thing. It's kind of fattening up his reserve fund. And he says when the programs need the money, they'll pay it back. And I guess he will. He'll have to, actually, because in the long run, that's the only legal way you could spend that money.
You know, there was a wholesale change to education with this budget, the first time in 4 decades that they are giving money to the local school districts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is probably something that's long overdue. If you might recall, the state took over the financing of schools in 1978 when Proposition 13 was passed. And then 10 years later, the education community got the voters to pass Proposition 98, which put the formula for distributing that money into the state constitution. Now the governor's coming along and saying that's not really working very well, that it's a mishmash, it's complicated, it's not unfair, and by all standards it is unfair. There's just no rhyme or reason to it. Schools get great differences in the amount of money they get. So he says he wants to make it simple, he wants to eliminate a lot of the earmark programs, and he wants to give relatively more money to the school districts with large numbers of poor children and English learner children. That means big urban districts like Los Angeles Unified, and it means some very small rural districts. In some of those small rural districts, 100% of the kids qualify under those criteria. And even in some big school districts, it's big. In Fresno, it's 92%. In San Bernardino, it's 92%. In LA Unified, it's 84%. And that's where the districts that the governor wants to get the money, because he says it's unfair to poor children to not give them the extra attention they need to get ahead.
Right, it's about equity. Dan Walters, I want to thank you so much for joining us, talking about the budget. All right. The Supreme Court's ruling on genetic patents ends a nearly 2 decades-old monopoly held by Salt Lake City-based Myriad Genetics. It opens up competition in biotech and will provide more resources and medical information for everyone. Lauren, I want to start with you on this case. Give us the specifics.
Yeah, it centers around 2 genes. They're called BRCA1 and 2. And these are genes that are really important when it comes to finding out your breast cancer or ovarian cancer risk. Now, Myriad Genetics has held the patent on these genes, which means they control the test on these genes. So if you were a patient that needed that test, you could really only go to one place. And this case came about because people were upset about that. They wanted to get second opinions, and that wasn't really possible.
Right, and the test is it's very expensive.
Yeah, several $1,000s.
Right, right.
So this decision, you know, I think it's interesting for people because you kind of say, well, wait a second. I mean, genes, they're inside me. How can somebody hold a patent on that? And what the Supreme Court said was, okay, in that case, if what you're doing is just taking a gene out of somebody's DNA, that's not patentable because that's a product of nature. However, there is this other part, which is synthetic DNA. And this is where the patents are still standing. The Supreme Court said you can still hold a patent on that. That's because what they do is they take the gene, they make a copy, and then they take out the parts of the gene that they don't really need. When you do that, you can still use the gene to maybe develop a new treatment or a new test. But because you're doing that manipulation, because you're taking things out of it, that's a man-made invention, and that is patentable.
You know, the company, when they were trying to assert their right to have a patent over a human gene, what kind of legal argument were they making there? Because they can't claim they invented it, only that they found a way to identify it, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it kind of goes back to the very beginning of patent law. You know, we think maybe, okay, well, light bulbs, right? It was also chemicals. That was very early patents were on chemicals. And so what they were arguing is that by isolating it out of your DNA, they were tweaking the molecule because it wasn't the way it was before. It was a slightly different molecule, and therefore they could patent it. And the Supreme Court did not agree with that.
What are the implications as biotech firms move forward after this ruling, you think?
I think it's a really interesting question, and one we're going to see play out a lot. I mean, this is 30 years of the biotech industry relying on these patents. It's the basis. A lot of the big biotech companies, especially here in the Bay Area, you know, they didn't seem too concerned about it. That synthetic DNA part, that's what they really heavily rely on. But certainly, I think it's going to take a while to shake out because, you know, this really, it's kind of a sea change in gene patents.
Was it unexpected within the industry? Did they really think that they were going to be able to hold on to the patents?
Well, I think people were hoping for a narrow decision like this in the sense that, you know, some patents are still standing, some are not. Certainly the really big winner here is the genetic testing companies aside from Myriad, right? Because they haven't been able to offer this test, and now they can, and many of them are very excited about this.
Their competition opens a huge door. Now that we're mapping the genome and you know, medicine is becoming much more personalized, I'm wondering the effect on this, you know, moving forward for drug research and just research and development.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing people have been talking about with this case. You know, we kind of used to think about it as one gene, one disease, and now there's a much more kind of sophisticated look, which is, you know, you've got a lot of genes that interact together. It's kind of this whole genome look, this personalized medicine look. So I think one thing that people were saying is, you know, really this opens up a lot more research, because when people do look at multiple genes or maybe develop drugs or treatments kind of looking at these things, they don't to worry that some of those genes are protected. It kind of broadens it a little bit.
What does this mean for university-style research as opposed to a private biotech firm? Does this change anything for people at, say, UCSF?
Yeah, I mean, UCSF is a great example. They hold a lot of patents. A lot of biotech companies here in the Bay Area have spun out of UCSF. You know, some of the early patents were written just like the one Myriad had, which was, it was very broad. It was a blanket patent, and it gave that company, when they licensed it, a lot of power. Universities have been a lot more careful to say, well, we're not going to lock up this information with one company. When they've been licensing things, they've been doing it much more broadly with exceptions so other people can do it. So, you know, I think it does affect some patents, but I think universities have been kind of aware of this issue for a while.
Certainly the big winners here are individuals. You know,
It's absolutely true. I mean, because it's a several $1,000s test. Because people can actually go somewhere else now, they say it's going to drive down the cost quite a bit. And there's a lot of people, this is a very important genetic test, not just this test, but other tests that people really, you know, they want to be informed about their risk.
Is that the kind of change that's going to happen instantly, though, in the marketplace, or are we going to have this lag period for a year or 2 or 3 where these other companies have to roll out their own tests and get them out there?
Yeah, we don't quite know yet, I think. But what is interesting is that, so Myriad's been doing this test for a very long time. They have a lot of test results, and when you're looking at what a mutation means, you need a lot of data to figure out what that means. And so what Myriad is going to be saying is saying, hey, we've got a huge database. We can analyze your test better than anyone else. So they're going to be claiming a competitive advantage in that way. That's going to be their approach, I think.
All right, so interesting. Thank you so much. San Onofre nuclear power plant is off the grid, leaving Southern California with a gaping hole in its power supply. 2,200 megawatts, which powered more than 2 million homes. With summertime approaching, there is concern that the system will not be able to accommodate such a power deficit. You know, David, the decision to close this plant was fairly abrupt, even though it was shut down in January of 2012.
It was. It's been a very contentious process for the company Southern California Edison that co-owns and operates the plant. It's been very contentious for them to try to come up with a plan to restart the plant and then convince the community and convince government regulators to let them do it. And that's essentially where things fell apart. It looked like in order to get permission to restart the plant, they were going to have to go through a series of public hearings, laying out exactly what they planned to do, how much it was going to cost, and all that kind of stuff. And they didn't really have a good idea whether or not they'd be able to restart at the end of it, or how long that whole process was going to take. In the meantime, every day it's closed, they're having to buy replacement power. And the license on this plant doesn't last that much longer. It expires, I think, in 2022. So calculating all these things together, they basically just said, okay, we're throwing in the towel.
They had to find resources for energy in the meantime, and they did. They were able to fill that vacuum. But
they've spent about $500 million in the last year just buying the replacement power.
Right. So filling that vacuum now, summertime is approaching. There are some concerns that, yes, that we were able to work with it, but you know, what does the future look like? I
mean, that's the nice thing at this point, since we did get through one summer without the plant. They know it can be done. And they know roughly what they have to do. Now, if we have a really hot summer down in LA, that will change things. And if some of the power plants that they're relying on for the replacement power start running into problems, which does happen, that will change things too. It's going to be kind of a tight margin down there. We're sort of lucky in Northern California in that we're pretty removed from this. I mean, we have more than enough electricity to get us through the summer. This should not be a problem for us. But for people down in Orange County, San Diego County, and the southernmost part of LA County, there are possibilities that supplies could get tight.
One of the interesting things that this has really brought up is, you know, for all of its issues that people may raise about nuclear power, there's no greenhouse gas emissions coming out. And California has some pretty ambitious goals to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So, I mean, how is this going to work? Are we going to see kind of a spike here because they may be replacing it with fossil fuels?
Yes, we just don't know how big. Now, at the same time that this thing is going to be taken out and removed from our power mix, we are going to be adding a lot of renewable power. There are very large solar power plants out in the desert that are going to be coming online later this year. They've been under construction for years. So that's going to be coming into the mix. That's zero carbon, like the nuclear power plant. But a lot of the replacement power is coming from older power plants burning natural gas. Some of those may get retrofitted, some of them may just stick with their existing technology. So we know we're going to see more greenhouse gases out of this, but at this point we don't really know how much.
You know, this is the third nuclear power plant to go offline this year and possibly a couple more behind it. What does it say to the nuclear power industry? What is it to say to that energy source that we are, you know, we're losing them?
The industry is having a tough time, and this industry a couple of years ago thought that its moment in the sun had finally come. You go back 5 or 6, 7 years, and there was just an incredible sense of optimism among these companies, these people. They felt, you know, climate change is serious. The government's finally starting to get serious about doing something about it. We're going to help. We know how to do this. We can build these plants. The problem that they ran into, A, there's still no permanent storage solution for the waste. B, more importantly, the banks don't really want to lend money to these plants. The last round of construction, most of the plants came in way over budget and over time, and that's not something bankers like. We've got this handful of plants that's moving forward now, but you look at the one that's farthest along, the Vogtle plant, where they're adding 2 reactors to an existing plant in Georgia. That project, if it stays on its budget, is $14 billion just to add 2 reactors to an existing plant. Really
quickly, how long is it going to take to decommission this plant?
We don't know yet. They have to actually present a detailed plan for exactly what they're going to do to take it offline for good.
All right. Thank you very much.